Logan. I am an editor with Marvel Press, and I've worked with Sam on a YA book, which is part of why I'm here. I'll kick it over to you, Sam, to introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for watching our panel at Storytelling Across Media with Comic-Con. So excited to be here. My name is Sam Maggs. I storytell across media, which is what we're going to talk about today, particularly in regards to my work for Marvel. I've written for video games for Marvel, like Marvel Spider-Man. I have written, as Megan said, YA novels for Marvel, like The Unstoppable Wasp, which Megan was my wonderful editor on. I also write comics for IDW through their Marvel Action line, like Captain Marvel, with appearances from characters like the Wasp as well, and Squirrel Girl and Spider-Woman and all kinds of stuff. So super fun to get to play in that universe across a variety of different mediums. And that is what we're going to focus on today, I guess.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool.
Excellent. So knowing that you've worked in so many different mediums, I know you've done video games, you've done comics, you've done fiction, nonfiction, so many formats. Yeah. Do you have a preference, or does it change?
I do have a favorite. It's interesting because I really like working collaboratively, and with novels, you have your editor. Like, you and I got to work together really closely, which was great. But novel writing is largely a solitary process, where you're kind of writing the whole thing by yourself, and then you send it off to someone to be like, I hope it's good. And then you get feedback, from you and from the folks at Marvel, or whoever the IP holder might be. Whereas video games, like the opposite end of the spectrum, where it's super collaborative. You can have, on a AAA game, you can have thousands of people from all over the world working on the same game at the same time. And for storytelling, it puts you in a certain set of constraints where you could want to tell a story about, the example I always use is like, I want to tell a story about 7 unicorns that fly through the sky. And then someone's going to be like, in programming, like, well, the engine can only handle one thing on the screen at a time. So can it be 1 unicorn instead of 7? And you're like, yeah, I kind of changed the story. Okay, fine, 1 unicorn. And then someone in rigging is going to come to you and be like, we only have a rig for a goat. So now your story about 7 unicorns, this has to become a story about 1 goat. And so you're like really limited. I wouldn't say limited, but it creates a unique problem set where you have to really work the narrative into something that still makes a fun game, which is a priority with video games. It has to feel fun first and foremost. That also like works within the constraints of the engine, your programming department, what the game can actually do, all that stuff. So you're really collaborating with all these different people and serving a lot of different masters, where storytelling is just one of many, many things that make a video game good. Comics is sort of the intermediary between both of those, where you have the collaboration between your editor, but also your artist, your colorist, your letterer. You have a slightly larger team, but you also don't have the same technical constraints as in video games, which is not to say like I can write anything. Like, I am aware that someone then has to draw that, and they may be very frustrated with me about that. And comics are largely like most of comics is the art. So, but I would say that comics strikes that like really great middle ground for me of like collaborative, but also really like free and open to artistic expression. So comics is my answer, but I still love books and video games. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, I think almost on a philosophical level, all storytelling is about limitations. There's a limitation to everything that you do, whether it's, page number or like, obviously the limitations in the art or the actual, like, what can the engine handle? It's all limitations. And I think everything that you do comes back to like pace, emotion, and character.
Yeah.
But when you're dealing with these like wildly different formats, it's so interesting to see the intersection of like, okay, how do you deal with emotion in the storytelling format where somebody is actively moving a character through a space versus when you're moving from panel to panel, your attention is so different. I think that's such an interesting part of it. Do you find yourself thinking about the way that the audience is going to interact with your words, from medium to medium, and how does that change? How does that influence the way that you work?
Definitely. I think there's there are certain rules for each medium that you can play with and break, of course, but that generally apply. One of the best comics advice I've ever received is that when writing a script and when you're describing a panel, if you ever use the word "and," you have made an error, because a character can't do two things in one panel. Like, a character can't stand up and high five someone. Those are two different actions. They have to go in two different panels. So that's like, there are rules like that, or like guidelines that you can follow. I think that this question is especially meaningful when it comes to thinking about video games, because you do suddenly have this extra layer, which is the player is inhabiting the character, the protagonist. In books and in comics books, it's more of a passive experience where we get to craft exactly how the audience receives that story. And that includes pacing, order, timing. In a lot of video games, especially ones that are more open world, I think about this a lot with games like Dragon Age Inquisition, which is one of my favorite games of all time, but I still struggle I played a million times and I still kind of couldn't tell you what the story is, because I'll like do a story mission and then I'll like dick around for 40 hours collecting elf fruit, and then I come back and I'm like, the heck am I doing? Like, what is the plot? But you can't, that's part of the game experience, right? Is that like, you want players to be able to explore and take their time and do things in whatever order they, in a lot of games, in whatever order they want or at whatever pace they want, but you have to account for that. You also have to, especially in RPGs or choice-based games, you have to account for the fact that not all players are going to have, nor should they have, the same experience. So that is incredibly different from a comic book where everyone's getting the same experience at the exact same pace, or a novel where that you can. One of my favorite things about writing the Wasp novel is that we got a lot more time with the interiority of the superhero, in this case the Wasp. Comics and games are very action focused, and a lot of page space and performance capture time and like video time when you're watching cutscenes is dedicated to action, because players and readers want something exciting to happen. They want to see something dynamic on the page or on the screen. And also, people making the games want to spend their money on something dynamic. They usually don't want to spend performance capture money on like, then two people have a really intense conversation about their feelings, which is like what I want to see in a video game, but not overall what a lot of people want to put in or play in a video game necessarily. In books, action is also important in books, and we spent a lot of time in the Wasp working with Marvel to make sure that the action scenes in the Unstoppable Wasp novel felt like the action scenes in an MCU film, which is it was very challenging. It was the most challenging part for me of writing this book. I think we got them to a really great place, but it was really hard. But the benefit of that is you get to spend a lot of like interior time with these characters that you don't necessarily get to do in a comic or a video game. The priority isn't on that so much. So it was great to like think about like, how does Nadia feel during a fight scene? What does it feel like to shrink and be moving in slow motion? Like, what are the ramifications emotionally of like dealing with having superpowers? Like, these are not things we typically get into in like a 20-page comic for kids necessarily, or like largely most AAA video games. Like, it's not like where a lot of them want to spend their time, which I totally get, but you get to focus on different things depending on the medium. I feel like I've really strayed far from your initial question.
No, that was great. And I feel like it's so interesting, especially in thinking about video games, how much of that emotional work tends to, for better or worse, I mean, there are ways where it works really, really well and ways where it doesn't, but where it gets punted to like notes that you find. So
totally.
Like, I'm playing The Last of Us right now, finally. I'm like finally finishing it because I stopped being afraid of zombies, I guess, in the middle of a global pandemic. It's fine.
Completely understand.
Yeah. And so much of that emotional work of like, how did these people feel as this was progressing ends up unfolding in the notes that you find, which I find so interesting. Like, I mean, it's fascinating to me, the way that you can use something that on the surface of it feels maybe a little bit flatter than what you would expect in a game, because you really are just reading words on a page, But Mass Effect does that as well. There's so many words in a Mass Effect game with stuff that you pick up, and there's so much story there. It's wild to me how much story lives in those games.
It's true, and a lot of that using like non-VO text, so like not voice recorded stuff, like stuff that you read in game, is kind of like then it becomes optional, so story focused players can spend the time to get that extra emotional investment, but players who don't care about that so much and are more action focused players can skip it. But then I do feel like something is also kind of lost as well. It's a really interesting balance in games. I think one of my favorite examples of a game that does that really, really well, I think, is Horizon Zero Dawn, which I'm not sure if you've had the chance to play, but it's so good. And it was one of the rare cases in a game where I found myself obsessively hunting down and listening to every single voice memo because I wanted so badly to unfold the backstory in the game and to know exactly what happened. And they paced out the mystery of that so well. It's just, they like, mwah,
it's
so good.
So good. Yeah, it's incredible because it feels necessary. Like you don't have to do all that to like get something out of the game, but you do. There's a huge reward for it if you do invest the time, and that's like just such a happy medium. Yeah, no, I'm obsessed with that game.
Same, so good.
It's so good. But in terms of writing different things, and I know you switch back and forth with quite a bit of frequency and those require really different muscles moving between those mediums. Do you find that you have like a specific ritual or a warm-up when you're kind of moving to a new muscle group, as it were, to keep the metaphor?
I like questions like this because I felt for a really long time as though fiction writing was not meant for me because specifically of the way that a lot of writers talk about writing as this sort of like, there's always this like mysticism to it of like, I need to like light a candle and connect with the muse and my characters speak to me from beyond the veil, and I just knew. And if you are a writer who is like that, I'm incredibly jealous of you. I think that's amazing, and that's wonderful. I have never once in my life experienced mysticism around my writing like that. For me, writing has been something that I've practiced and learned and gotten better at by sitting down and doing it and making things and finishing things and then moving on to the next thing and then making another thing and finishing it and moving on and practicing. And the answer to this question is very similar to that, which is like, no, like honestly, no. Usually I will sit down and try to do like one thing at a time, like I'll sit down and I'll write a video game mission and then maybe I'll step away for like an hour or 2 hours and go play a video game or go read a book or like go sit in the pool or whatever, like chill for a little bit and then come back and do the next thing. But I'm a pretty firm believer in like, you don't need a special desk or a special location or a special ritual or any of that stuff to write, because the truth of it for people like me and for a lot of like professional writers, I think, is that like, and for you as well, probably, is that like writing is a job. It's super fun. I feel super fortunate that this is what I get to do for a living. It's amazing. But there is a risk when talking about work like that it makes it easier for people to undervalue your work or to pay you less, because it's like, this is a fun thing you're doing, so you should like want to do it for free or for less than you're worth. And I don't think that's the case, because at the end of the day, like, it is a job. And for writing like this, I just like, you have to sit down and do it. You just have to sit down and do it. It's really hard. There's not a single day of my life that writing is the hardest thing I've ever done. It feels like pulling teeth every single time. I always hear people who are like, oh my God, I can't not write in a day. And I'm like, I can not write in a day all the time. It's awesome. I find it really difficult. But it's something you just have to sit down and do. And I don't believe in the advice you have to write every single day. Breaks are healthy and stuff, but I do think that you have to finish things.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of people are always like, I really, really want to be a writer. And if you're writing, you are a writer, so that's amazing already. But what's going to get your work seen and what's going to get you hired for stuff is finishing things and then putting them out there. Because if people can't see examples of your work, then they're not going to know what your voice is or what you bring to the table, or even frankly, just like the nuts and bolts of you can finish something. Because there are a lot of people who start things and not a lot of people who finish things. So finishing things really puts you like in another echelon, essentially. Even if you don't love it. I don't love half of the stuff that I make. It's okay. You know, I'm like hard on myself. Like most writers, I think, read their work back and are like, okay. You know, like we're hard on ourselves, but
totally,
you have to finish stuff. And that's how you learn and get better. So yeah, no specific ritual. I have been trying to make my desk setup more ergonomic, however, because I am an ancient crone now. I'm getting like neck pain from writing like this on my couch all the time. That's maybe my most specific ritual is I got like a wrist rest.
That's
trying
important.
to like sit up straight. It's really hard.
Yeah, you got to be able to sit there long term to finish stuff.
Yes,
that's so
totally
important.
Yeah,
I mean, you know, I think some of the most valuable writing advice that exists is twofold. It's, first of all, everything you do is writing. Everything you take in, everything you consume, all of the things that you choose to experience and the way that you curate your experience is writing. It will inevitably inform what you do. And the second is, I think it's from an essay from Daniel Jose Older this has been years ago. It was in a magazine, but he said it was basically debunking that you have to write every day myth. And I think the big takeaway was writing begins with forgiveness. So when you don't get something done, you can't move into the next session of work with guilt. You have to sort of free yourself from that misconception that work unfolds in a linear fashion, or that like if the conditions are right, you will produce the same kind of work and the same level of work day after day. It's just not how it works.
No, I love that. It's something that I struggle with a lot, especially when it's just not coming. There are just days where it just doesn't want to happen. And for a really long time, I would just sit there and try to force myself to make something happen, and nothing good would happen. And then I would have wasted the whole day. And it's really been a challenge to teach myself, like, step back and go watch TV for 6 hours or whatever. Because, like, that's going to be a better, but don't feel guilty about it. That's going to be a better use of your time. Because as you say, you're taking in and you're thinking and your brain is percolating and all of that stuff. That it is part of the process, even if it feels like not being productive, but it's really hard to get over that.
It is. It's true. And I think this sort of leads into my next question, which I'll set up just by saying, like, a lot of what I've found helpful in whatever work I'm doing is, I think it came from Victoria Lee, who had talked about
her.
She's amazing. But this idea that when you read, especially if you're stuck, you can read actively. And I guess it's like going back to some favorite things that you have and looking at specific, I mean, maybe it's the transitions between one scene to the next, or dialogue, the way that things are treated. But I found that one thing that I do, like, as a warm-up is, it's not really a warm-up so much as, like, if I'm working on prose stuff that I feel doesn't have a lot of flow, I'll just go read poetry and then I'll come back to it and, like, end up trimming things down a lot. And I'm wondering if there's anything that you go to creatively that you feel like, is it a certain artist or a certain kind of writing that you feel helps you kind of smooth out the edges?
That's a great question. I love the idea of reading poetry when your prose is feeling bloated, because I'm very verbose. Like I tend to write very flowery text sometimes. So that's really cool. A big one for me is, this maybe doesn't necessarily count, but the kind of music that I listen to when I write can help a lot. If I'm feeling really, really stuck, I listen to a lot of movie and TV show soundtracks. Big for me. That's like most of my writing material is made up of that. Or working on Unstoppable Wasp, I listen to a lot of like synth wave for some reason. That was like really speaking to me on that book. But like music without lyrics for sure is good. Or like action movie music, because it kind of puts you into that mindset, or like whatever kind of feeling you're trying to go for, using the music from a property that has that feeling can kind of like jog your memory and put you in that zone. I find that that helps a lot. When it's really not coming, I go back and I read old favorites a lot of the time. Like Tamora Pierce's books were my favorite books growing up. I read them probably once a year, and every time I revisit those, she has such a great way of writing that it makes me want to like emulate that in a way, or you can like to Victoria's point, you can take things out of that you're like, oh, I could do more of this or do it this way. That really helps. And then for me, a lot of the time it's actually disconnecting from narrative entirely. So because I do work across all mediums, a lot of the time, like doing anything can start to feel like work. Reading a book feels like work. Reading a comic feels like work. Ingesting a very narrative video game starts, because it's very difficult to turn your brain off when you feel like you're constantly like, I would have done the story this way. Oh, I feel like this character moment didn't land. Oh, how did they do this in the game where they did this? Like, you're constantly like analyzing. And so I find myself a lot of the time playing video games that have no story. I've gotten really invested in like battle royales and like multiplayer games that have really fun character dialogue, but don't necessarily have any story to them beyond like they're friends, hang out or whatever. And being able to like disconnect entirely from thinking about story and narrative is really, really helpful. Or else I feel like I'm working all the time, which again, I feel very fortunate that it's hard to read a book because I make a book. Like that's like great problems to have, right? Like I'm very fortunate again, but you do have to like rest your brain sometimes, or you stop coming up with like good ideas or good solutions to things. I'm at a point in my career right now where I have written a bunch of books and they're all coming out, but I don't have any like future books right now. And I'm like, I have to think of like the next thing. This is where I am right now, is like, what's the next book? And I'm fortunate that I have enough other work that I can take the time to think like, what do I really want to make? But there's also like, I know that idea will come to me, or the way to execute that idea or whatever will come to me when I'm not trying really, really hard to figure it out. People are always like, I want to find someone to date, and it's like, you have to stop looking for someone to date, and they will appear for you, which was true for me with my with my partner. But like, that's kind of how I kind of feel about where I am with publishing right now, is like I'm waiting. I think I have it, but I'm like, I don't know. Yeah, you kind of you have to turn your brain off in order to let things penetrate. Now I am talking about it mystically. Who have I become? But you know, from a very practical standpoint, you can't be thinking about this stuff 24 hours a day, or like you'll run yourself into the ground and nothing interesting will come out of you. That's how I feel.
No, it's totally true. And if you overthink something like an outline, or you're like, okay, it makes sense for me to do this, this, and this. If you're like, logically, you're probably already on the wrong track, because you're coming at it from such a dispassionate angle. And you know, I mean, there's all kinds of advice where people say, write the book that you can't imagine not writing, or that like refuses to not be written. Which is so hard, because if you're in the space where I'm like, but I want to write the book, but what is it? It's a frustrating place to be. But I think the more that you take in and experience other kinds of art, you know, the more inevitably you come up with like, okay, I've got this like totally off the wall bananas idea that I never would have come up with if I were just like sitting at my desk writing logically in an outline.
And that advice too, like write the thing that refuses not to be written, like follow your heart or whatever, is great advice, but not always great advice for like a working writer. Like a great example of this is like, I got asked recently to pitch on the Transformers meets My Little Pony comic, and like that is not something I spent a lot of time thinking about prior to that moment, but you know, you want to work on it, so then you have to sit down and be like, okay, what do you think for stuff when you're pitching all the time on comics and in video games, you know, you have to sort of come to it with like, okay, here's 10 ideas that I barfed onto the page in 20 minutes. Like, do you like any of them? And then like you can spend more time drilling down. So it's not always about like finding the dream project. Like when this is your job and it's what you do all the time, sometimes you have to be like, people ask me, like, where do I come up with the ideas for my comics? And with Captain Marvel, a lot of the time, it comes from a place of, like, the first thing I think about is, like, what do I want Carol to learn? Like, what do I want her lesson to be coming out of this? Then I think about, who do I want her to learn it with? Like, who do I want her to partner up with in this comic? Because I always like to put her with different female superheroes so that they can get, like, cool female friendship stories or female relationship stories. And then third is, like, what's the fun gimmick? Cats. Time travel. What's the cool thing, you know? And then you put those three things together and you get a cool comic. But that's not, like, that's a much more practical way of thinking about writing, as opposed to, like, I just had to tell this story from my heart. But it doesn't make it any better or worse. Like, I think, you know, they're still great comics. It's just, when you're doing writing as a job, when you go to like, writing for video games is like a 9 to 5. Like, in the before time, you go to an office every single day and you have meetings all day and you have deliverables and, you know, team barbecues or whatever. Like, it's a cool job, but it is a job, right? So, and there's a lot of, like, technical aspects to that of, like, well, this story beat can only happen on this planet. You only have 30 seconds to deliver it, and you have to do it while they're fighting 2 demons or whatever. Like, that's another very, like, odd and technical form of writing. So, yeah, it all depends on the circumstance.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think I get a little bit of a reputation in our editorial department for being a structured dork, but it's for that reason, is like decoding the creative process and being able to give yourself a starting point. Like, what do I want Carol to learn? And then being able to put the pieces in around it absolutely just, like, strips away all of that mysticism. And, like, you can, I mean, there's obviously a place for, like, the idea that just won't leave you alone.
Yeah.
But when that is absent and you still need to get work done, structure is always your friend.
Yeah.
Always.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love that. And I think that's why there are so many different tools that you can use. Like, there are so many different books you can read about writing or strategies or whatever. But video games especially likes to look at those things as prescriptive, because a lot of the other stuff they do in video games, you have, like, a rubric, like, the quality has to be X. The graphics have to look like Y, you know, whereas storytelling is very nebulous, right? But you're in a corporate job and you want to be able to, like, mark these things on a rubric where I can, like, check off this story has ABC. And so you can get very, like, if this mission doesn't follow every step on Dan Harmon's story circle, or if this doesn't follow Robert McKee's story, like, it's not a good story. And it's like, comics and novels do not fall prey to that kind of thinking at all. And video games are, like, very focused on, we can crack the story code. Look, someone's done it. Follow that and you will have a good story. And that's really interesting about writing for games. It's something that bothers me a lot, because I believe those are all tools in your toolbox that you should feel free to use or not use with discretion, because there is, like, if someone had cracked the code, we would know.
Yep.
We would know. We would all use it.
it would be invariable. There would be no more bad games. They just wouldn't exist.
Or stories in general. Like, they would all be perfect. Yeah. Yep. So that is a really interesting thing about video game writing, where people really want to quantify it, like, scientifically, in a way where you can say, like, XYZ make a good story. But I think that's not the case. And oftentimes the games that are the most praised for their narrative are the ones that think really outside the box. Yeah, it's interesting.
It's wild. There's always a way to go too far, right? Like, you know, there's, like, I think structure is valuable up to a certain point, but if I come to you and be like, Sam, here in Act 2, I think this beat is 2 pages late. Like, it's an exhausting way to work. It's not a fun way to read. It's not the way you get to a good story.
Yeah, like, I totally agree. And you are such a great editor. Like, I had such a great experience working with you, because you are so good at pulling out the structure moments, but then also the emotional moments, and figuring out how they all work together in a way that makes for then a compelling, but also sensical story, which is good with, like,
I appreciate that.
Yeah, because I think if I was left to my own devices, I would just write about feelings, people having feelings for, like, 200 pages, and nothing would happen.
I mean, I think the thing that I was so struck by, though, in working with you was the clarity that you had in outlining. And I know that outlining is an important step for you, but, when we were going through that part of the process, if you will.
Thank you. The Canadian in me thanks you very much for that.
Yes, of course. But it was so clear, like I think when you have such a clear roadmap, you had such a clear sense of where we were going at all times that it made that part of it, I don't know, I guess much smoother.
Oh, thank you. I think people who don't outline are wizards. I think it's amazing. I don't know how people do it. I
I
think
don't
it's
either.
because I come from comics and game writing, especially, like, you have to outline. Like, if you're making a $600 million video game, like, no one's gonna let you just like write some scripts. There's like a million approval processes, right? So like you have to write an outline, and then like your boss and his boss and his boss and then the guy at Sony and then the guy who owns, so like all those people have to be like before you can actually make the thing. And the same is true in comics. Like you don't just write a comic script and like send it around to people like, do you like it? Like people are like, they come to you and they're like, Transformers meets My Little Pony, what do you got? And you send them some like high level ideas, and then you transform that into an outline, and then the people at Hasbro will read it and they will give you notes, and your editor will give you notes, all this before you go into the script stage, which I love because it lets you get a really clear top-down view of like emotional beats over the course of the story, plot beats over the course of the story, get all that set out. And then when you start to write the book, especially something like a novel, you can feel free to not do any of those things, because inevitably as you write, things will change and it will become clear that like, oh, I thought I would put this in this chapter, it works better over here. I thought this beat would work, it doesn't actually make sense anymore, we're gonna have to change it. And that's when you and I would connect and be like, this doesn't work anymore, what do we do? And then we figure it out.
Right.
So you can be flexible with it. It's not you're not like married to it, although in games traditionally you are pretty married to it, but that's a whole other story. But like you at least have a good, to your point, roadmap to follow, where you can kind of, this is how I like to work. There is no right or wrong way to work, but I think because all of the other writing I do necessitates extreme outlining, I like it with books too. I like to know where I'm going. I recently had like a fun idea for a novel that I think I want to pursue, and so I just started writing it, and I got like 10 pages in and I was like, I can't do this anymore. I should like put it aside and be like, I have to go back to the outline, because like it was just it was nothing. It was just nothing. Like again, it was a lot of feelings that were going nowhere. Like
it's so easy to get lost though. I mean, when you're talking about I don't off the top of my head know how many words a traditional comic script runs, but when you're talking about like Wasp ended up being 65,000 words ish, there's a lot of trees to get lost in. Like there's a lot of weird turns you can take, and if you don't have, I find that if you don't have a map to go back to, I get lost very easily. I get distracted, and it's not bad. Some of that distraction's useful. There are detours that can lead to great things, but it is, I mean, it is so easy to get 10 pages in and be like, all right, well, I have gone down a tangent and I don't know how to get myself back because it
or even where I was going in the first place. Like,
right,
exactly. There's no path to go back to. So it's like, yeah, definitely. And the same is true of a 40-hour video game. Like that's a whole lot of time for random tangents. And with comics, at least a single issue is like 20 pages. It's like 3,500 words. It's a little harder to get lost in that. But when you're talking about 6 issues that all have to follow a thread, like at that point, if you start issue 1 and you don't know where you're going in issue 6, you get the Rise of Skywalker. So don't tell anyone at Star Wars I said that. I'll get involved.
I mean, listen, it would be more controversial if it weren't true.
You should try to know where you're going. That's all I'm saying.
All I'm saying is that maybe they should have looked at an outline. But in all of these mediums and all of these very different kinds of writing, do you find one to be more cathartic than the rest?
Ooh, this is such an interesting question. I want to say different parts of all three. This is like a cheat answer, but I find writing the deep feelings in novels very cathartic because you get to like really, for me at least, I get to really dig into like deeper parts of myself and investigate what that's about. A lot of people said very kind things about Nadia's voice in Unstoppable Wasp and how she was like all over the place all the time, and that comes from me being like having like a lot of anxiety and like probably undiagnosed ADHD and like just that like mind going 24 miles an hour all the time. Like, is that fast? I don't know anything about miles. 100 miles an hour, maybe, I don't know, kilometers.
Yeah, there you go.
So like I can put pieces of myself into the deeper parts of it in a novel. In a comic book, it can be really fun to, the catharsis there I think comes from just doing really wacky out there stuff. Like it's so much fun. Comics are just so fun and short and sweet, and you know, I can bang out a first draft like really quickly, and it's fun to just like get something fun and exciting out onto the page and see something finished quickly and also published quickly, because video games take 6 years to come out typically, and novels probably 2. Comics, like they come out like 3 months after you write them. Like the turnaround process is very fast in comics, so that feels really cathartic in the way that it's like gratifying. You get to see your work like happen really quickly. An artist brings it to life really quickly, which is so talented and amazing, but like you get to experience that, like I made that, I made something, it's done, is great. And then for video games, I love writing short but sweet side missions, almost for the same reason as the comic, because you get to be like totally bonkers and out there, like because side missions are not these like very deep to traditionally like main plot stories. They're like, one of my favorite side missions of all time is Borderlands, where you go and shoot that guy in the face. It's like, shoot me in the face, and you shoot him in the face, and it's like complete, like that's genius. That's brilliant. I think it's amazing. Like writing stuff like that is so fun because you get to, it is almost like writing one issue of a comic book in a video game, kind of, because they're usually like 15-20 minutes. They're short, they're sweet, they're self-contained, they're kind of silly usually, or fun in some way. So that, I guess what I'm saying is the two things for me are like short, sweet, finished fast, so you can see the results of your work and do something really out there and fun, but then also there is a certain catharsis in like getting a deep part of yourself out onto the page in a way. So like two different sides of the spectrum.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, and I think that's so valuable, and one of the great things about working in different mediums, because I mean, I find that I'm an over explainer. Like I will just explain something to death, and a lot of what I end up doing is paring things down. It's like, okay, all this was useful, but we're gonna just trim it back and really make it very disciplined. And that's part of my personal process. I just know that whatever I end up with is going to be much longer than the finished product at the first draft stage. But I love dipping into picture books for that reason, because like if you're working in novels and you're like, this is going to be an exploration of grief and personhood, it's going to be long and sad, and that's fine, and it's great, and it's going to be a very like rich journey, hopefully, if it's written well. But when you're in picture books, you can be like, you know, character X is a good hero because they use the pain of this loss to channel it into helping other people. No further questions. Like, that's it. Draw your own conclusions. And I think there's something valuable about that. Again, it comes back to limitations, right? And like thinking about what you can and cannot say, and sort of leaving it up to the audience and kind of tailoring it and every piece of that medium the best way that you can for audience interpretation. But knowing that the shorter and more concise it is, the more freedom your audience is going to have to interact with it in their own way, for better or worse.
I honestly struggle with that so much. I am the same. I overwrite everything. Love adjectives.
Yeah, of course.
Adjectives I could all the time. Like I too am a parer downer.
Yep.
For that same reason.
Listen, everything's writing, even the pruning.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So in moving between different mediums, have you felt, not necessarily your process, but your style of writing change? I know that some of it changes as you get older and the more you read and the more you take things in, but do you feel any influence in like the changing of mediums, changing your work?
Yeah, I have found that writing for comics has made me a much better writer, or has maybe elucidated the fact that one of my strengths in writing comes in writing all ages work. I came into writing thinking I would always write for teens, but a lot of the work that I've done over the last couple of years has ended up being middle grade, and did not start out being middle grade. Like, we came into them being like, this will be a teen book, and then we made it and it was like, no, it's a middle grade book actually. Like, works really well for that sort of like tween age, which is not something I ever really considered doing, and frankly didn't even really know. Whatever, when I grew up there were like chapter books and then you read Lord of the Rings or whatever. Like, there was not there's like a lot more nuance in publishing now than there was when I was growing up, and so like I didn't even really know that was a thing you could do or specialize in. So that's been interesting, that it turns out that my voice lends itself well for middle grade or all ages work, which I have come to really enjoy doing. That's a really fun and important, I think, space. When I think about the books that have stuck with me, or the media that stuck with me most over the course of my life, it's the stuff that I loved when I was 11 and 12. So I think that's really interesting. But then also, given the amount of like work for hire or contract or IP work that I do, my voice has to change depending on the project. And so there is a sort of exercise in like accessing different parts of your writer self. Say if you're writing for like Shooty Man's Serious Game versus like Game for Children, like those are two very different voices that you have to access. Or like, you know, writing a YA novel versus writing middle grade comics, like those are two very different voices. So there is sort of a necessity to it, but I have found that there are a few things that I'm just like sort of uncompromising on, or that are core to like everything that I write. And the first is humor. Like, no matter what I write, it has to be kind of like silly, or have some, even if it's for like a serious project, it has to have some humor in it in a way, because I think that even very serious storytelling, like you can't get the seriousness without the, like there is some levity. Even in war, there's levity or whatever. Like people find ways to joke around and be funny and stuff. And it's just a very human thing to use humor to like mitigate feelings or situations or whatever. And things that are overly grimdark and take themselves really seriously, I just like don't fit my voice, and that's okay. And the second is chicks. I'll put chicks in it. Like, I want to write about women. I want to write about female friendship. I want to write about queer women, because these are all the things I did not really get to see growing up, with the exception of Sailor Moon, which is why I feel like it has stuck with our generation of girls and women so much.
Right.
But yeah, that's like, I always want to write about girls and women's experiences. And you know what's really interesting? I have noticed, so I find, whatever, everyone has like weird gender dysphoria. I find the word woman or women to be very like, I would never use that word to describe myself, and I don't know why, and it's not something I've spent a lot of time interrogating. I spent a lot of time interrogating my sexuality growing up and never my gender. I don't know, but like I don't like that word. And I've seen some commentary in Wasp where we call a lot of the grown ladies in the book girls instead of women, and I was like, I recognized that came from me. That came from like a weird insecurity or dysphoria or like flaw or something in me that looks weird on the printed page. But like I read that and I'm like, yeah, that sounds right. But it's just so interesting to see how like your own personality and biases and things like that come out in your own work in ways you like don't even think about. But that is one of the things that I write about all the time, is I write about women and female friendship, and that's like really important for me to include in any media that I create, because I feel a responsibility to do that. I feel it's a responsibility. So yeah.
I mean, I think that's an interesting point. I never thought about it, but now that you say that, yeah, that is 100% how it goes. And I think the reason that I didn't I obviously didn't flag it. The reason I didn't flag it is because I feel the same way.
Yeah, totally.
You know? Like, if somebody describes me as like a woman, I'm like, I mean, yes, but like,
I wouldn't say I'm not, but also like it feels weird. Like, yes, totally. But it's so interesting to see how like our own feelings about ourselves and our gender, like influence the things we make. And there's definitely a piece of that in all of my work, including my game writing and my comic book writing and our books, that like, you know, we are navigating working in these worlds, geek culture, comic books, video games, even, you know, publishing to a certain extent, that are really dominated by dudes and traditionally have been, not in terms of people who consume it, but in terms of the people who are allowed to create them, and what influence that has on our work across all these mediums is really interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's something that I feel like I'm too like close to really interrogate with any like real value necessarily,
No,
but it is something that I think about a lot.
I agree, and I think I have thought about it a little bit, which is the best thing that I've come up with is that there's something that is inherent about growing up and having like being a part of the queer experience in just like society at large, that you know, it's very easy to feel alienated from like the traditional idea of femininity, and especially the word woman, because it is so tied to that like traditional experience. So I think queerness divorces us from some of that, and yeah, I don't know. It's weird that I don't have the same aversion to the word girl.
Maybe no, me neither, because... which could be in many ways it feels like maybe infantilizing in a way where you would not call people boys or whatever, but it's like, I don't know. I just don't know, but it does influence everything that we work on and everything that we write. And I think about that, you know, to a certain extent, that's in the back of my mind a lot when I'm writing in video games and in comics. And a lot of the time now I think that people are realizing like, oh, having different perspectives from creators is important and leads to a greater diversity of stories and more interesting stories and experiences that we haven't seen on the page or the screen before, which is great. But it makes me think like, okay, you know, if I'm part of what I bring to the table is this portion of my experience, right? And how does that, whether I realize it or not, influence everything I make across the board, including silly video game side missions, you know, including comics for 8-year-olds. And that's sort of where I feel like that responsibility comes from, because I wonder if you and I had seen more media that we loved that had gay characters or bisexual characters. I didn't even know bisexuals were like real until I was like 26. The experience obviously is now very different for people growing up because of the internet.
Right.
Goodness, but like, you know, or even like having a team with more than one girl ever, or like seeing female friendship where like the women weren't competing with each other, but they were cooperating with each other on a team or whatever. Like, I think about the ways that that would have influenced me. And so I really want to actively put that into my work. I also still want to, though, tell a objectively good and interesting story about interesting, good characters. You know, you're trying not to just tell like moral tales that are meaningless or not interesting in any particular way. Like, but you want to infuse good storytelling with these things that are also like important messages and responsible messages for the people playing or reading, which are that like queer people exist and women are people. Like, I guess.
Right. Totally.
Whatever. Like, you know.
Weird. Such a It's, and I think, I mean, we could talk for hours about
this
gender.
is like a whole other panel that we haven't landed on, but
it's so true. But yeah, I mean, just, you know, the way that we talk about different characters and like the way that you talk about gender and the way that you like use certain words and why is woman such a loaded word for it? Listen,
it's something we run into in video games all the time, and a fight that I've had endlessly in my career in video games, especially where they want to put in women characters, but then they feel they have to code them a certain way visually so that the player will understand that they're a woman. And then so you get really weird things like a anthropomorphic shark with like boobs and lipstick, and then the dude shark doesn't have that, and you're like, oh, okay, default shark. Like, it's just, it's bizarre. And the weird arguments that I've gotten into about like, why would the shark have boot? Like, does it feed the mammal with the boot? Like, no, it's a shark, so we don't need to have it has a notably female voice actor, so people will probably get it. Like, you don't have to, but it's a fight. Every time. Wild. It's a fight, you know, but it's because we have these really ingrained ideas societally of like instant short forms. Where we're like, well, we put lipstick on her, they'll know, and then we don't have to spend any time explaining like whatever. And it's like, yes, but we have to like teach ourselves to not do that anymore, to like unlearn that. And it's a really difficult process. And we're here to talk about storytelling across mediums. I feel that it's important to say that it's, when you are a person of marginalized gender who works in video games or tech, or, you know, even sometimes comics, so I have been incredibly blessed in my time in comics with the creative teams that I have worked with, that this has never been an issue for me in any way. But, you know, you are often the person who has to fight those fights purely because you exist in the body in which you exist. And this goes double, of course, for people with multiple marginalizations, an intersection of being a person of color, queer, non-binary, like whatever, disabled, however many different intersections you may have. It just falls to you by default to make those arguments, which then of course can get you labeled as like the shrew or the harpy or the feminist or whatever, which is why it's so important to encourage allyship in these spaces, and to have like people who do have privilege, like for me to speak up for people of color that I work with, or you know, for straight people to speak up for queer people, and et cetera, so that the brunt is not, the onus is not constantly on the marginalized person to be making that argument. But like, to be totally honest, like most of the time it is. Most of the time it is, and it's really, it is an aspect of your work that exists if this is a thing that you care about. It doesn't rule.
Yeah, it's a tremendous amount of pressure. It's true.
Yeah, and this is true across all storytelling forms. But again, like sometimes part of the job of publishers or editors in comics or whatever is to partner the right writer with the right editor, with the right artist, with the right team. And I feel like that's why Wasp was so great, because you and I have such similar like goals, values, storytelling, like dreams, like all of this stuff. Like we don't argue about stuff like that. Which is great, definitely. You know, and that's been a great part of my experience across all mediums, but especially comics and novels, to have like teams of people with who want to tell the same kind of story. Yeah,
definitely. And I think that leads into my next question, which is it kind of goes back to what you were talking about in terms of like having humor and women be a part of everything you do. But thematically, have you had any realizations about your work and on a little bit deeper level, the kind of thematic stories that you want to tell going forward?
Yeah, for sure. I never set out to make every single story be about female friendship. This was not a thing that I thought about and was like, I have to do this. It just like happened. Every story that I wanted to tell was about like basically all chicks. And like basically everything I do, there's like the peripheral guy maybe, but like, which by the way is always like, people are always like, but there's no men in this. And nobody ever says that about books that are all, there's no women in this. You know, it's like that amazing Ruth Bader Ginsburg quote, bless her heart, where people are like, how many women on the Supreme Court will satisfy you? And she's like, 9. And they're like, that's all of them. And she's like, yeah, and there have been 9 dudes and nobody said anything about that. So like, you know, it's that kind of feeling where like most of the meaningful, important relationships in my life are me and other women, girls, you know, whatever, like friends, my mom, female mentors, like, which is not to say I haven't had wonderful relationships with men and male mentors and male allies in my life as well, which is certainly true. And my dad is great and my husband is great. And like, you know, but these are the stories that I want to tell are about these women and their relationships with each other. So that is something that has come about very organically, but has turned out to be something that I'm very passionate about showing in as much of my work as I can. And the other thing is, I love to read romance. I love it. When I was growing up, I was like, I want as much makeouts in my teen fiction as humanly possible, because I was a big loser, nerd, dork, and was not getting any, obviously. But like, when I write, I like typically have no interest in that at all. Like, I've written 2 asexual characters now, one in a video game and one in a book. It just like it never happens for me. I'm always writing about like passionate platonic relationships, and I'm never writing about passionate romantic relationships. And I don't know if that's something that maybe I will explore in the future potentially, but it is something that I have again noticed that like I'm writing about not that all the time. And I think maybe that's okay, because a lot of the times we do have this focus on, like, if there's a girl in a story, there always has to be a romance. One of the reasons why I love Pacific Rim so much, because that never comes into it. And I think that's like brilliant. But that isn't to say that I think it's bad, because again, like, if there's no boning in the story I'm reading, I feel really cheated. Yep. So it's like, what I recognize the dichotomy here, where I'm like, I want to read about the passion and like makeouts and stuff, but when I go to write that, I'm like, no, I can't. I don't want to. Like, I just end up writing about friends. So I don't know what that is necessarily, but it's definitely something that has become apparent to me.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, my big question is, when are we going to get like a friendship dating app that matches people based on drift compatibility?
Doesn't that exist? I feel like Bumble has like a friendship function now. Well, I've never used a dating app in my life. But I'm
talking about specifically
drift
compatible are you?
Now I love that.
That's what I want to know.
Yes.
Bumble doesn't have that metric.
You're right. No, but I think
not into that.
I wish there was more focus in general on the importance of friendship.
Yeah.
All our most long-lasting relationships are platonic.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true. One more question.
Yeah.
For you. What's next? What's the medium that you haven't tackled yet that is on your list that you want to speak into the universe?
TV.
Nice. Yes.
I can't say too much about it, but things are happening.
That's fantastic.
I've wanted to be a TV writer since I was 11 years old. It was my initial dream, and I never knew how to do it. I was a kid in a small town in Canada. I had no idea how to make that happen for myself. And there are many people in similar circumstances who do make that happen, but I was not able to figure it out or crack that code. Mm-hmm. And I ended up doing basically every other thing first on the way there. So I'm going to try television next, I think.
Nice.
But I don't know. We'll see.
That's so exciting.
Thanks. But mostly I just want to continue doing more of this stuff. I love books and comics and video. I'm so passionate about all three mediums, and especially IP storytelling. Mm-hmm. I do feel like original storytelling is very valuable, and I do that as well. But I love playing with these characters that I grew up with and that I was so in love with as a kid, and being able to like do things with them now.
Totally.
Tell my own story with them. So Megan, this was wonderful.
This was so good. Thank you for this chat.
I miss you.
I miss you too. It's been so long.
I know.
What the
pandemic. And also, I did this today. Everyone watching in the US should go and vote. Please do that.
Yes. Please register. Please do it as early as you can. I have my absentee ballot from Iowa coming soon.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
That's such a huge priority. And I hope by the next time we do one of these things, we're in a much better place.
I hope that too, Megan. Thank you to everyone watching for joining us for Storytelling Across Mediums. Megan Logan, Sam Maggs, read our stuff, play our stuff, I guess. We'll see you at cons when they exist again.
Yes.
At Comic-Con especially. Bye.